people who worked in the night shift and switched only to the day shift. What was the reason?
I worked as a security guard in a large supermarket where night shift seemed easy at first: cameras, patrols, silence. But over time, I began to notice strange things. Silhouettes appeared on the cameras moving between the aisles. Even though the store was closed, I went to check. No one. Once I heard something fall in the toy department. When I approached, all the dolls were lying on the floor, as if someone had pushed them down at the same time. From that moment, I began to fear even entering dark departments. Every night I heard quiet footsteps following me. Even when I stopped, colleagues laughed, saying it was the usual sounds of an old building. But once I heard a voice clearly say my name, it came from a dark corner where there was no one. I began to lose sleep. My nerves were giving way. Once I saw in the mirror the reflection of a man in a black coat standing right behind me. I turned sharply. No one. The following nights I saw him again. But not only in the mirror, he stood between the aisles, looking at me, and when I approached, he disappeared. The scariest thing happened that night when I heard someone breathing heavily right behind me. I turned and saw all the cameras simultaneously, showing this man standing in different parts of the store. I rushed to the exit, but the doors would not open. Only after a few minutes they suddenly opened by themselves. I filed a request to be transferred to the day shift, and still. When I pass by that store during the day, it seems to me that someone is watching me from inside through the windows. I was a nurse on the night shift in an old hospital. The corridors were long and dark, the lamps flickered, and the silence was oppressive. Once I heard footsteps behind me. I turned, empty. But the footsteps did not stop. They followed me even when I stopped. Later I began to see a woman in a hospital gown. She stood near different doors, sometimes looking directly at me. Her eyes were empty, and her lips whispered something I could not make out. Once I heard her say, "You are next." I ran. But the corridor seemed endless. With each night her image became clearer. She began to appear not only in the corridors, but also in the wards. Once I entered a room where a patient was lying and saw her by his bed. She looked at me, and the patient began to scream that someone was choking him. I rushed to help, but the woman disappeared. Colleagues said it was hallucinations from lack of sleep. But I knew it was not a dream. The worst was that night when I heard her walking behind me, and all the ward doors began to open and close at the same time. I barely made it to the post and sat there until morning, not leaving. After that, I could not stand it. I switched to day shifts, because at night the hospital seemed like a place where not only patients lived. Sometimes during the day I see that same ward, and it seems to me that the door is slightly ajar, even though they are always kept closed. I worked at a factory where night shifts were the hardest. The machines roared, but the workshop seemed empty. Once I heard someone call my name. The voice came from a dark corner where there was no one. I thought it was a joke from colleagues, but when I approached, there was only old equipment. The following nights the voices repeated. Sometimes they sounded as if several people were whispering at the same time. I began to lose sleep. My nerves were giving way. Once I heard the voice of my late grandfather who said, "Leave this place." But the scariest thing happened that night when I was alone in the workshop. The voices grew louder. They screamed, laughed, cried. I saw shadows moving between the machines. Even though the light was bright, I rushed to the exit, but the doors would not open. Only after a few minutes they suddenly opened by themselves. After that I began to fear even entering the workshops. I heard someone walking behind me, saw tools falling by themselves. Once I saw words appear on the wall. "You are not needed here." I realized I would never return here at night. I switched to day shifts. And although during the day the factory seems ordinary, I know that at night something else lives there. Sometimes it seems to me that even during the day I hear a quiet whisper, but it quickly disappears. I worked as a night guard in the old city library. The building was huge, with high ceilings, wooden stairs, and endless rows of bookshelves. During the day it looked majestic, but at night it turned into something completely different. The silence was so thick that every step echoed like a gunshot. The first few weeks of night shifts seemed even romantic to me. I sat at the desk, listened to the old clock strike the hours, and patrolled the empty halls. But over time I began to notice strange things. At first it was small details. Books lying not where I'd seen them before, chairs slightly moved. I thought it was my inattention. Once, while patrolling the second floor, I heard a quiet whisper. It came from between the shelves. But when I approached, silence. I decided it was a draft or old pipes. But the next night the whisper repeated. It was longer, and I clearly heard my name. With each shift the situation grew worse. I began to see shadows moving between the shelves. They were quick, as if someone was hiding from me. Once I saw a figure in a long cloak standing by the window. I approached, it disappeared, but on the floor remained traces of wet boots. Though outside it was dry, the scariest praise it, then nighted. Something happened that night with an 8-ankle nighthurst of clear, rhythmic. I approached the table, there lay an open book. But the room was empty. When I leaned closer to look, the pages began to turn by themselves. I began to lose sleep. During the day I was exhausted, and at night I felt the library lived its own life. Once I heard footsteps on the stairs. They were heavy, slow. I hid behind a shelf and saw a man in an old suit descending the stairs. He walked straight toward me. When I finally dared to come out, the stairs were empty. After that, I realized I could no longer work at night. I filed a request for a day shift. Now I enter the library only during the day when it is filled with people and light. But sometimes, when I pass by that same table, it seems to me that the pages of the book quietly turn by themselves again. I worked as a night dispatcher at a small railway station. During the day, this place was noisy, trains, passengers, cargo. But at night the station turned into something completely different. Empty platforms, the hum of the wind, flickering lamps, and the feeling that you were left alone in the world. At first, the night shifts even seemed calm to me. I sat in the booth, listened to the radio, watched the monitors. But over time, strange things began. I heard someone knocking on the door. Though the station was empty, sometimes trains appeared on the monitors that were not in the schedule. They passed the platform and disappeared, as if they had never existed. Once I heard a voice on the radio that called my name. It was impossible. No one had access to this frequency, the voice repeated. Do not stay here. I tried to turn off the radio, but it kept working. With each night the situation grew worse. I began to see people on the platform. They stood motionless, staring at me. And when I went out to check, there was no one. The scariest thing happened that night when I saw a train stop at the station. The doors opened, and passengers came out. They walked silently, looking straight at me. Rushed back into the booth, and when I looked at the monitors again, the platform was empty. After that I realized I could no longer work at night. I filed a request for a day shift. Now I work during the day when the station is alive and noisy. But sometimes when I see an empty train standing without passengers, it seems to me that it is waiting just for me. I worked as a night guard in a large shopping mall. During the day this place was crowded with people, noise, music, children's laughter. But at night it turned into a huge labyrinth of empty corridors, dark shop windows, and the feeling that you were left alone in the world. The first few months of night shifts even seemed interesting to me. I patrolled the floors, checked the cameras, listened to the hum of the air conditioners in the silence. But over time I began to notice things that could not be explained. At first it was small details. A toy lying in the middle of the corridor though the store was closed. An elevator arriving on a floor where no one was. Once I heard children's laughter. It came from the play area. I approached empty. But a ball rolled across the floor as if someone had just pushed it. The next night I heard footsteps. They were light, quick, and stopped every time I stopped. With each shift, the situation grew worse. I began to see shadows moving between the shop windows. Once I saw a woman in a white coat standing near a clothing store. She looked at me, but when I approached, she disappeared. Wet footprints remained on the floor, though outside it was dry. The scariest thing happened that night when I heard someone knocking on the service exit door. I approached. The door was locked, but the knocking did not stop. I opened. Behind the door was no one when I returned. All the cameras showed people walking through the corridors. They walked silently, staring straight into the cameras. I rushed back into the booth, but the feeling that they were near did not leave me. I realized I could no longer work at night. I filed a request for a day shift. Now I enter the mall only during the day when it is filled with people and light. But sometimes when I see an empty corridor, it seems to me that someone is standing there, waiting for the night to come again. I worked as a night guard in an old business center on the outskirts of the city. During the day, the building looked completely normal. Offices, coffee machines, people in suits. But after the second night, everything changed there. Around 2:40, I began to hear footsteps on the 7th floor. The problem was that the entire floor had been empty for several years after a fire. I thought it was homeless people or some worker staying late. The first time I went up there with a flashlight and a radio, the floor was dark. Dust lay in a thick layer, and the office doors were sealed. But the footsteps did not disappear. They were somewhere ahead, as if someone was walking slowly and deliberately, not rushing. One night I heard a woman's laughter, quiet, very quiet. It came from the end of the corridor. I really felt a chill inside me. I followed the sound and saw an office door open that had definitely been closed an hour earlier. Inside stood an old desk and a computer. The monitor was on. On the screen flickered the image from the surveillance cameras, and there I was. I was standing in that office looking at the monitor. But the problem was that physically I was in the corridor. I just ran out of there downstairs. After that night, I began leaving the lights on all floors, but it did not help. The cameras started glitching. Sometimes recordings showed a dark silhouette near the elevator. Sometimes doors opened by themselves. The worst happened about a month later. I was sitting downstairs at the post and heard someone whisper through the radio. "You are not alone tonight." The voice was female. On the shift beside me, there was no one. I did not tell the management. They would have thought I had lost my mind. But I stopped sleeping normally. Even at home, it seemed to me that someone was standing in the corridor of the apartment. One morning, I came back after a shift and noticed my hands were trembling so badly. I could not insert the key into the door. Then I realized I could no longer handle night shifts. 2 days later, I transferred to day work. And you know what? Another guard who took my place quit after 3 weeks. He explained nothing. I worked the night shift at a gas station near the highway. This place was creepy in itself. Around it was forest, almost no cars after 2 in the morning, and constant fog. The strangest thing was that people sometimes came in as if appearing out of nowhere. Once around 3 in the morning, a man in a wet black coat entered the station. Outside there was no rain. He silently approached the counter and asked, "What time is it?" I answered. He smiled very strangely and said, "I am late," then just left. A minute later I noticed there was no car in the parking lot. The next week I saw him again. The same clothes, the same question. But this time he stood closer. His eyes were unnaturally dark. I told the guard we had a strange client. He checked the camera recordings and turned pale. On the video, the doors opened by themselves. There was no one. After that, I began to fear the night shifts. But I needed the money, so I stayed. One night I went out to take out the trash and heard someone calling me from the highway side. The voice was quiet. "Help." I followed the sound and saw a man standing near the forest. It was him. He looked straight at me and smiled, and then I saw his feet were not touching the ground. I literally ran back inside and locked the door. Until morning I sat with the light on and a knife in my hands. The next day I quit. The boss thought I was joking when I explained the reason, but I did not care. I just never wanted to see the night again. I worked as a night taxi driver, and to be honest, night people are completely different. During the day you drive office workers and students. At night, drunk, strange, aggressive, or just very lonely people. But after one incident, I never worked after sunset again. It was sometime in winter. Around 2:30 in the morning, I got an order in the area of old private houses. The place had almost no lighting. When I arrived, a girl in a white jacket was standing by the road. She silently sat in the back seat and gave an address. While we drove, I noticed in the mirror that she was not looking out the window but directly at me, without blinking. That already made me tense. After a few minutes, I tried to start a conversation, but she was silent. Then very quietly she said, "Do you see her too?" I asked, "Who?" And she pointed into the dark field by the road. I looked there literally for a second and saw the silhouette of a woman. She stood far away among the trees, motionless, just staring at the car. I turned back to the road, and when I looked in the mirror again, the back seat was empty. I braked sharply. The doors were closed. The snow around the car was clean. No tracks. I swear my hand shook for some 20 minutes after that. The worst part was that the order in the app disappeared, as if it had never existed. After that night, I still went out for a few more night shifts. But every time I panicked when someone sat in the back seat. After a month, I finally switched only to daytime. I worked the night shift as a hotel administrator, an old hotel in the city centre. Beautiful during the day and very creepy at night, especially the 4th floor. Guests constantly complained about strange sounds, footsteps, knocks, water running in the bathroom. Though the rooms were empty, one night a man from room 417 came down to me. He was pale as a wall. He said, "Someone is walking in my room. I thought it was neighbors or pipes." I went upstairs with him. When we entered the room, everything was normal. But then the bathroom faucet turned on by itself. The man literally ran out into the corridor. I went into the bathroom and turned off the water. And then I heard a woman's laughter behind me. Very quiet, right by my ear. I rushed out of the room, but the corridor was empty. The next night, strange things began appearing on the cameras of the 4th floor. A dark figure stood at the end of the corridor. Sometimes the room doors opened by themselves. The guard thought it was a glitch, but I saw it with my own eyes. Then one guest told me a phrase after which I could no longer work normally. She asked, "Why does a woman walk through your corridor at night?" I said there was no one, and she replied, "Then who stood by my bed all night?" After that, I began to fear even looking at the camera monitors. At night, every sound seemed abnormal. I lasted another 2 weeks and switched to day shifts, and honestly, it was the best decision of my life. I worked as a night loader in the port. At night, this place looks like a separate world. Huge containers, thick fog from the sea, cranes creaking in the darkness, and almost complete silence. The scariest thing is you constantly feel as if someone is watching you. We had an old warehouse near Pier No. 8. It was almost unused after one of the workers died there. A container fell directly on him. The Golder men did not even like to mention this place. One night I was sent there to check the goods. I went inside and heard a metallic sound, as if someone was hitting the floor with a chain. Then I heard footsteps above. I thought someone was there and went upstairs, but the 2nd floor was empty. And then I heard someone running very fast below between the containers. I shone my flashlight and noticed the silhouette of a man. He ran behind a container. I rushed after him, but there was no one. Only wet, barefoot footprints on the concrete. After that, strange things began in the warehouse. Containers opened by themselves. Cameras turned off for a few minutes exactly at 3 in the morning. And once the radio turned on by itself, and I heard the phrase, "He is still here," the worst happened at the end of my last night shift. I was standing by the pier and suddenly heard someone whisper my name right behind me. I turned sharply. No one. But below by the water stood a man in a wet robe. He looked straight at me, and his neck was unnaturally twisted. I almost fell in panic. After that night, I never agreed to work after sunset again.